gentleman you've just been looking at is Jose Raul Capablanca, and he was a world champion of chess from Cuba. He was the only world champion of chess from Cuba. And the story about Capablanca was that when he was a child, he used to watch his father play chess against one of the local army officers, in fact a general. And the general would come over on Sunday nights and they'd play chess after they'd had a nice big meal and smoked a few Cuban cigars, no doubt. And Capablanca would watch, and his father would let him watch as long as he sort of sat there quietly. He was a very small child, 4 years old. And Capablanca watched for a couple of weeks, and then after one of the games and the general had gone home, Capablanca declared to his father that he'd cheated. And his father was not too impressed by this, and Capablanca was asked to explain himself. So Capablanca set up the exact position on the chessboard and showed his father that in actual fact he'd moved a knight illegally. Now, his father and the general were both so weak at chess that neither of them had noticed this. But Capablanca had basically learned all the rules of chess just by watching the game, and the next week his father got him to play the general, and he beat the general. And so Capablanca learnt chess for himself. Nobody taught it to him. That's the sort of myth around Capablanca. He was a very, very, very strong chess player. He was born in Cuba and ended up being educated in America. Whilst he was in America, he used to pay his way through college giving simultaneous exhibitions. So he'd play hundreds of people at once, charge them a small fee and offer them a prize if they could beat him. And he continued playing simuls all through his chess career. Capablanca's style was a style that was very strongly suited to playing simultaneous exhibitions. His positions were not as complex as the positions that came up when other grandmasters played, but he had an incredible understanding of how to win through small advantages. And he would take these small advantages into the end game of a chess game and then push out a win, crunch a win out. And this ability to win end games is what he's most famous for. And so we're going to have a look at Capablanca in action in an endgame. This is the position. Capablanca was playing white, and a very strong Russian player called Tartakower was playing black. And this game was played in 1924. And it illustrates all the key principles of excellent endgame play. Now, definition of an endgame is basically a situation where it's unlikely that the king will be checkmated with the pieces on the board. So, although it's possible in this position that one of the kings would be checkmated without a pawn being promoted to a queen, it's not likely. And so this is defined as an endgame position. You'll see that material is basically equal. Capablanca has a bishop as opposed to a knight, and the bishop appears to be more active, that is, it's attacking more squares and it's nicely centralized. But essentially, same number of pawns, and both players have a rook as well. In endgame play, it becomes very important who can promote a pawn. And so it's really a matter of looking at the pawn structure and creating a plan to promote a pawn. A major difference between middle game play and endgame play is that the king must be used as an attacker. There aren't many pieces left on the board, and so the king has to be active as an attacker. And he's about as valuable as a knight or a bishop if he's used properly. So just imagine playing a position where you've got one bishop left and your opponent has two bishops. It's pretty tough to win. Well, if you leave your king inactive in an endgame, then it's similar to doing that, playing a whole piece down. And the other key idea is time. And I'll explain more as we go along in this game about the idea of time. Basically, it becomes a race as to who can promote their pawn first. And if you can promote a pawn to a queen, it doesn't really matter if you've given up 3 or 4 points of power, 3 pawns or a bishop or something to do so, because you get a whole queen, so you get an advantage in material. So this idea of time becomes more important. Who can get a queen first? Now, we've discussed the relative power of the bishop and the knight. The key pieces on the board at the moment are the rooks, and we need to be able to activate our rook if we're going to win in this endgame. In other words, we need an open file, a file with no pawns on it, that we can control. So although the E file is open, Black's got control of it because he's got his king and his rook there. So playing your rook across to e1, whilst it will activate your rook, it's most likely that the rooks would then end up off the board. So Capablanca came up with a plan to activate his rook. He played h5. So in the short term he's offering his pawn, but that's easily recaptured by the rook. And so h5 is attacking in the segment of the board where white has more pawns. On the king side of the board, white's got 1, 2, 3 pawns, black's got only 1, 2 pawns. And so that's the most likely part of the board for white to be able to create a queen. Tadakawa's response was to play his rook to f6, and then Capablanca captured the pawn. And in this position, Tadakawa took back with his pawn. So he's basically played into Capablanca's hands here because he's allowed Capablanca to activate his rook. Capablanca now plays rook h1, and this rook here now has a nice open file that he can attack down. And you'll see that Capablanca now has 2 pawns versus 1 on the king side instead of 3 pawns versus 2. So his advantage in terms of being able to create a passed pawn is even greater. A passed pawn is a pawn that has no pawn that can stop it from getting to the other end. So at the moment there's no passed pawns on the board. But if we remove this pawn, that pawn wasn't on the board, both the f pawn here and the g pawn would be passed pawns. There's no pawns blocking them from getting to the end of the board. The first step in promoting a pawn is to create a passed pawn. And so Capablanca is moving towards creating a passed pawn here. Now this powerful rook is a threat to Tadakawa. He's basically allowed it to happen. Probably shouldn't have recaptured with his pawn in that position. But now that this rook is powerful, black has to be careful about it invading down to the 7th rank or the 8th rank. And so he's forced to move his king across. Moves his king to f8 so that he can hopefully stop the rook from its invasion. But rook straight down to h7. And now this is a very, very powerful rook. It's got an open file and it's attacking horizontally across at the pawns as well. And in addition to that, it's trapped the king on the back row. We talked before about the fact that the king has to be active in an endgame. He has to be an attacker. Well, if he's trapped on the back row by a rook, then he can't do very much. So he's an inactive king. He's not going to be able to be very powerful. And so Tadakawa's got a few problems in the position now. The first pawn that's threatened is the c pawn. Tadakawa plays his rook to c6. It defends this pawn and now it attacks this pawn over here. So it seems like quite a reasonable counter-attack to make. But now Tadakawa got a bit of a surprise because Capablanca played g4. He didn't worry about this pawn down here because he understood the idea that in an endgame you can give up some pawns if you're the first to get a queen. And he could see how he was going to be able to promote a queen over on the king side. So he didn't worry about this pawn over here. It's a less important pawn than these pawns here. So he played g4, which was a surprise move. I don't think Tadakawa would have been expecting that move. Tadakawa now plays knight to c4, activating his knight towards the center of the board. So he's not worried yet about that grabbing that pawn either. He knows he's got to activate his pieces. And now g5, pushing the pawns up the board. So he's storming his pawns up the board to get a queen. And now knight e3 check. The knight attacks. He's bringing his knight over to the king side of the board with a check, Tadakawa. So knight e3 check. And the king now goes up to f3. Now Tadakawa parks his knight at f5. Protected by the pawn here. However, this plays into Capablanca's hands because now he can create a passed pawn. Can you see a move that creates a passed pawn for Capablanca? If you need more time, press pause. Basically, bishop takes knight, creates a passed pawn. G takes, and now this pawn here is a passed pawn. There's no pawns between it and the back row. And so all the play from here will be about creating a queen with this pawn. Now Capablanca plays his king to g3, and he's activating his king into the attack here. Rook takes the pawn with check, and so you'll see that black has more pawns over here on the queen side, but as yet he doesn't have a passed pawn. He's behind in time. It's going to take him longer to get a queen than it will for white, and that's the most important thing in this position. So the rook took the pawn with check, and the king goes up to h4, advances up the board. So that's an important move for Capablanca. He's activating his king and moving it up the board so that it can help promote the pawn. Tadakawa now plays his rook over to f3, attacking this pawn here, and now g6. So marching the passed pawn up the board. Tadakawa takes the pawn with check, and the king goes up to g5, where it helps to support the pawn. And now Tadakawa plays his rook to e4. If he takes the pawn, then he starts to run into real trouble, because if he takes the pawn, the king comes through to f6, and it's not going to be very long before this pawn marches in for a checkmate. So he doesn't have time to take the pawn. So he didn't do that. He played to e4, and still Capablanca marches his king into f6. One of the features of this position is the pawn here, the black pawn at f5, helps to defend this king from checks from behind. And so the king's quite safe where he is, and he'll help support this pawn through to become a queen. Tadakawa attacks the rook with his king. Capablanca gives a check. The king comes across to h8. And now Capablanca snaps off the pawn that's been on pre for a while. Rook takes c7. Now you'll see in this position that white's actually threatening checkmate. Can you see a way that white would checkmate if it was his move? Yeah, rook c8 would lead to checkmate. After rook c8 check, all black would be able to do is block with his rook, and then after rook takes rook, checkmate. So he's actually threatening mate at the moment, which forces Tadakawa to put his rook on the back rank here. So now what you've got is a very active king, a very active rook, and a passed pawn that's nearly all the way to the end of the board, versus a very inactive king, a very defensive king, and now a very defensive rook as well. And so this idea of time has served Capablanca well. Another key idea in endgames is that there is no rush. So that's sort of in contrast to the idea that it's all about time, is that once you've got a one position, your position stays one. And the only way that this position can go wrong for Capablanca now is if somehow this f pawn marches down quickly and becomes some sort of threat for a queen. So even though he could probably have analysed deeply and won without taking the pawn, he just gets rid of this pawn. It's the only way that he can lose the game now, and it's off the board. So a little bit of safety first there. And Tadakawa's really got nothing too strong now, so he plays rook e4. There's no checkmate threat now because the king's moved away from the checkmate square. So the rook can become active again for black. And so king back to f6, reintroducing the threat of checkmate, but this time Tadakawa uses a check from behind. Now this pawn's gone, checks from behind work. King back to e5. Rook across behind the passed pawn now, attacking it. And check. So in this position, if all the pieces come off, it's an easy win for white. If he plays this move, white takes back, king takes here, and this is a very, very easy win for white because he can help protect this pawn from the side. There's really nothing black can do here. He's going to lose the game. Doesn't matter what move he plays, he's going to lose the game. Let's just charge this pawn up. And you've got all sorts of choices here. You can go in here. And there's nothing this king can do. He can't get near the queening square. And a win. That's a win. So even though he's attacking the pawn, there's no way that it can be captured. So g7 check is a strong move. Only real option for black is to play his king to g7, g8, because he, as seen, it's an easy win for white if he does anything else. Now Capablanca snaps off another pawn, and you'll see how inactive the black pieces are now. They're stuck defending the passed pawn. Tadakau goes down to g1, and now Capablanca starts taking everything in sight. And rook c1 by Tadakau is to defend this other pawn and keep the rook active. King moves up. He's really got no good moves now, so he's just playing waiting moves as he awaits his fate. And Capablanca again is using this idea of keeping his king behind a pawn so he can't be checked from the rear. So just moving his pieces back and forth now, waiting for the end. And Capablanca offers the exchange of rooks because he knows that he's got an easy win if the rooks come off the board, similar to what you saw before. Yep, so he's offering the exchange of rooks, which black can't go for. So he attacks the A pawn. King across to c6. Rook takes the pawn, but it's not an important pawn. Some pawns are more important than others in endgames, depending on how close they are to queening. So now he just advances the other passed pawn that he's got, the D pawn, Capablanca. Rook across to attack it, and just pushes the pawn. There's an old saying by, I think it was by Nimzovich, that passed pawns must be pushed, and it's too true. So now we've got two powerful passed pawns, and there's not a lot that can be done. In fact, in this position, Tadakau resigned. If he takes the pawn with his king, then we get a situation where you promote to a queen and give check at the same time, and that's an easy win. The king has to get out of check, and that's an easy win from there. Try other moves, check like this, then the king just hides behind the pawn, and again you've got two passed pawns, and if the king gobbles up this pawn promotes with check. So again, easy win. So Capablanca demonstrated his mastery of the endgame in this position. He understood that it was about promoting a pawn, and he understood that his king needed to be an attacker, had to be an active player, and that you can give up some material. You can give up one or two unimportant pawns, or sometimes even a whole piece, if you can then go on to promote a pawn to a queen first, because a queen, of course, is worth 9 pawns. So hopefully that gives you some ideas about how to play the endgame. It's very different than the middle game, and your key objective is to promote a pawn. And sometimes you can play some fairly different sort of moves than you'd play in the middle game. You can give up a fair bit of material, provided you're first to create a queen. And if you're interested in endgame play, Capablanca's games are full of fantastic endgame play, and so they're good games to study. Good luck with your endgame play.